debt levels are rising at the kind of pace that normally you'd expect to see only during wartime. And you could probably argue that this is a bit of a war in the sense that it's a war against a virus rather than an enemy belligerent. But nevertheless, it's the kind of thing which adds to debt. And I think eventually there will have to be a debate about precisely who pays for this and when.
I talked to the CFO of the ESM today, Stephen, and he said, although it would save them hundreds of millions of dollars, or euros, I guess in this case, none of the EU countries that need it have tapped the ESM for anything. They prefer to go to markets and pay more. Why?
Yeah, well, I think part of the reason for that is that there's always a sense that if you ask for emergency bailouts, then the markets themselves suspect that something very badly is going wrong. So you have to avoid as fair possible.
It is going wrong. We've shut down the entire economy because of the coronavirus. I mean,
well, no, it's not so much that it's gone wrong. I mean, this is a deliberate policy decision, the difference between this and a normal sort of recession is that normal recessions are associated with a collapse in confidence, with maybe a weak banking system, et cetera, et cetera. It's a deliberate act of policy, and the hope is that if you preserve enough of the economic infrastructure, then things can rebound thereafter. And the important point about this is that the fiscal support we're seeing currently is not, the usual sort of multiplier policy, because there is no multiplier on the basis that everything is locked down. What you're trying to do is to pay a kind of insurance premium, an insurance payout, should I say, to preserve things in the hope that eventually things rebound.
Why are markets not responding to the crisis? I mean, what else can you call it in the US with protests there? Explain your thinking. What would it take, I suppose, for investors to think about that as actually something connected to markets?
Well, I think, first of all, what's happening in America is truly awful, obviously. Sometimes what happens that's truly awful doesn't necessarily resonate with markets because markets are being influenced by something else. And at the moment, it's pretty clear to my mind that markets are partly hopeful that the worst of COVID-19 is behind us. That's just a guess at this stage. But also hugely buoyed by the monetary and fiscal stimulus that's been put in place. But bear in mind that this is something which benefits listed companies much more than it does, say, small and medium-sized enterprises who are not directly connected to financial markets. So in some sense, what we're witnessing is markets being buoyed by the idea that large companies will survive this in some shape or form. But at the same time, that many people will lose their jobs and many companies will go bust because they're small, that they're not directly connected to capital markets, and they're the ones that are suffering.
Hey, just quickly want to ask about no-deal Brexit, Stephen. We've heard from a lot of people that because of the impact on growth of the coronavirus, a WTO deal wouldn't be as disastrous as it would have been before. I mean, it'll basically be absorbed in the drops we've seen already. Do you think that's true? Is it less likely to have a huge impact now if there's no deal?
Well, I think the effect will be roughly the same as it would have been previously. The only issue is that you can't see it quite so easily because it's massively eclipsed by what's been happening with COVID-19. So, the issue for the UK, in one sense, if there's a no-deal Brexit, is who do we do trade with? I think there are hopes of coming up with some kind of deal with the US, but the idea that we could do a trade deal with the US and China simultaneously, that looks to be a much smaller chance now than was the case maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So life is still going to be tough.
Yeah, okay, interesting. Thank you so much, Stephen King, for joining us this morning. Senior Economic Advisor at HSBC. Yeah, an interesting point that you make, Matt, in asking Stephen about the Brexit situation, because, of course, the UK, along with the US, amongst the worst countries to have performed when it comes to dealing with the pandemic.
Yeah, although the markets are pretty psyched about every country, it seems almost around the world. The global equity rally just continues. Right now, we're looking at gains of more than 1%. In Italy, more than 2% in terms of equity indexes here in Europe. If you're prepping for the U.S. Open, we have gains on futures as well, 0.4 to 0.6%. This is Bloomberg.
Did you know that with TuneIn's local radio feature, you can stream live FM and AM stations broadcasting in your area? Discover local news, talk, and music stations. Navigate to the local radio section under Browse to listen locally on TuneIn.
You love TuneIn for live breaking news from CNN, MSNBC, Fox, CNBC, and more. But when you can't catch your favorite show as it airs, it might just be a click away as a podcast. Search your favorite news station to explore all the on-demand news shows on TuneIn.
Buckle up, race fans.
NASCAR is back in the driver's seat.
And you can cut straight to the action here.
With the Performance Racing Network on TuneIn, you can hear PRN's live coverage of some of this year's top events.
As NASCAR's top drivers, Kevin Harvick,
Clint Boyer, and more get back on the track.
Search Performance Racing Network to listen and see upcoming races.
Let's be honest, we all spend too much of our day on social media. But at least you can spend your endless scroll time to discover new things on TuneIn. Follow @TuneIn on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to always be in the know about the best new stuff streaming in the app. From breaking news stories and live sporting events.
Yeah, but it's unique times. I think there's unique circumstances, and we're trying
to standout stations and podcasts. Stay in touch with TuneIn.
Hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on the Bloomberg Business app, and on Quick Take by Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Radio.
Live from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers Studios, this is Bloomberg Daybreak for Wednesday, June 3rd, 2020. Coming up this hour.
An eighth day of protest across the country brings mostly peaceful rallies to the streets.
Demonstrators and police clash in several cities but avoid major incidents or violence.
And at the White House, the president finds his show of force facing a backlash on all fronts.
Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio clash over the NYPD. Plus, controversial GOP Congressman Steve King loses his Iowa primary. I'm Michael Barr. More ahead.
I'm John Stashower in sports. An NBA Hall of Famer has passed away, and the NBA will vote tomorrow on a plan for playoffs that may not end until October.
That's all straight ahead on Bloomberg Daybreak. On Bloomberg 1130 New York, Bloomberg 99.1 Washington, D.C., Bloomberg 106.1 Boston, Bloomberg 960 San Francisco, Sirius XM 119, and around the world on BloombergRadio.com and via the Bloomberg Business app.
Good morning. I'm Karen Moscow.
And I'm Nathan Hager. Bloomberg Daybreak brought to you by BNY Mellon's Pershing. Learn why the world's most sophisticated advisory firms and broker-dealers rely on Pershing to help them improve profitability, create efficiency, attract talent, and manage risk at Pershing.com.
And U.S. futures point to a fourth straight day of gains, 501 on Wall Street, and we check the markets every 15 minutes throughout the trading day on Bloomberg. S&P futures up 13 points this morning. Dow futures up 159. NASDAQ futures up 32. The DAX in Germany's up 1.9%. 10-year Treasury down 6/32, yield 0.70%, and the yield on the 2-year 0.16%. NYMEX crude oil is up 1.7%, up 62 cents at $37.43 a barrel. And COMEX gold is down about 0.7% or $11.80 at $17.22.30 an ounce. And this data check brought to you by SEI. Today's competitive marketplace requires asset managers to become more operationally adept. See how you can transform your business with SEI's global platform at SEIC.com/IMS. Nathan.
Karen, last night saw marches and demonstrations from New York to Los Angeles. Protesters clashed with police in New York, Washington, and Brockton, but on the whole, it was more peaceful than in nights past. We have Bloomberg Radio team coverage on the very latest, beginning with John Tucker in New York. Good morning, John.
Nathan, the day began with mostly peaceful demonstrations downtown. Then, as the sun set and the curfew took effect, demonstrators in Brooklyn headed toward Manhattan. They were met by police that led to a tense standoff on the Manhattan Bridge where law enforcement blocked protesters from exiting in either direction. The situation was eventually diffused. Police allowed demonstrators to leave the bridge without incident. Mayor Bill de Blasio.
This early curfew has made a big difference. Everywhere I'm going, streets are much more empty. Huge amount of NYPD presence.
New York's 8 p.m. curfew will stay in place through Sunday. The city's public information office did report a looting incident in downtown Brooklyn. The department also said there was a shooting in Crown Heights, but it was unrelated to demonstrations. I'm John Tucker in New York. Now here's Martin DeCaro reporting from our Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington.
Massive crowds descended on the block surrounding the White House. Many defied a 7 p.m. curfew as they returned to the scene of Monday's show of force by federal officers who cleared Lafayette Park to make way for the president's church photo op. But this morning, a new chain-link fence kept them outside the park. Some threw water bottles and shook the barrier. Someone let off a firework. Security personnel responded by firing a chemical spray and pepper bullets. The crowd dispersed. I'm Martin DeCaro in Washington. Now with the latest on protests in Massachusetts, here's Janet Wu from our Bloomberg 1061 Boston newsroom.
The night started peacefully, even silently. Thousands of people laying down in Franklin Park as a symbolic die-in to honor George Floyd. In Brockton, a tense night as protesters faced off with state and local police. Other large groups ended up in front of the State House, as well as outside Boston Police headquarters, held back by barricades. Several times over the evening, police officers at BPD headquarters took a knee at the request of protesters in an act of solidarity. Janet Wu, Bloomberg Daybreak.
All right, Janet, thank you. Meantime, in California, crowds gathered in front of L.A. Mayor Eric Garcetti's home ahead of a 6 p.m. curfew. The city was on edge all day as retailers cleaned up from the prior night's looting and vandalism. We get more from Bloomberg's Chris Palmieri in Los Angeles.
It's been another day of protests, at least 3 or 4 very large ones marching in the streets, thousands of people. And unfortunately, what's been the pattern over the last 4 days is that these peaceful protests turn much worse as the nightfall comes.
The night in L.A. ended with no major incidents. Nearly 3,000 demonstrators in Southern California have found themselves in handcuffs since Friday. More than 9,000 people across the country have been arrested in connection with the protests.
Meantime, at the White House, President Trump is facing a backlash over his crackdown on demonstrations. The violent clearing of peaceful protests Monday for the president's photo op at St. John's Episcopal Church is being condemned by religious leaders, Democrats, and even some Republicans. We get more from Bloomberg's John Harvey in Washington.
He's been criticized by church leaders, castigated by the leaders of both the Episcopal